on the first night in his new apartment? Daniel dismissed the sounds as settling pipes. They were just the natural groans of an old building, he told himself, as he lay stiff in bed, his heart beating a rapid counterpoint to the faint whispers threading through the walls. Too indistinct to form words, yet unmistakably present like wind finding the smallest cracks in plaster. By the third night, denial was no longer possible. The whispers had become voices. Clear, desperate, terrified. They're watching. Get out. Don't let it know you hear us. Daniel pressed his hands over his ears, breath coming in shaky gasps. He scoured the apartment, knocking on walls, pressing his ear to cold plaster, seeking rational explanations, water pipes, air vents, neighbors, televisions, anything to dismiss the gnawing dread eating at him. The building's history offered no comfort. The superintendent had brushed off his questions with practiced ease. An old place like this has character, he'd said, avoiding Daniel's eyes. You'll get used to it. But the character didn't explain the voices that multiplied night after night. The character didn't plead for help. The character didn't warn of something lurking among them. Then, on the seventh night, the whispers ceased. Silence stretched long into the early hours, oppressive and unnatural. Just as Daniel began to drift into uneasy sleep, a new sound took shape, something heavy shifting inside the walls, slow and deliberate. A rasping breath, not whispers, not voices. Something else. Daniel held his breath. The weight behind the walls shifted again, slow and careful, as if whatever was in there knew he was listening. He wanted to move, to run, but his body refused, rooted to the mattress by a dread so thick it felt like hands pressing down on him. Then a scraping sound. Not inside the walls this time. Inside the room. Daniel's pulse slammed against his ribs. The darkness in his apartment felt heavier now, stretching into the corners like ink spilling over the edges of something unseen. He didn't dare move, but his eyes darted toward the doorway. The shadow of his bedroom door was darker than the rest of the room, too dark, swallowing all the ambient light from the street lamp outside. A breath, not his own. Something shifted within the shadow, as though it had weight like a body pressing against the door, unseen. He sees you, Daniel gasped. The whisper was no longer in the walls. It was right beside his ear. The shadow at the door began to stretch, spilling into the room like a living inkblot. It moved unnaturally, jerking and twisting, as though it were learning how to exist in his world. He knows. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't beside his ear. It was inside his head, reverberating like a scream trapped in a cavern. Daniel scrambled backward, his hands clawing at the headboard as the shadow loomed closer. The walls began to tremble, the plaster cracking and peeling as if something massive were pressing against them from the inside. Whispers returned, a cacophony of voices screaming in unison. Run, hide, it's too late. The shadow surged forward, enveloping the room in suffocating darkness. Daniel's screams were swallowed by the void, his body pinned by an unseen force. The last thing he saw was the wall splitting open, revealing a gaping maw lined with jagged, splintered wood and writhing tendrils of darkness. And then silence. When the landlord arrived the following day, responding to complaints about screaming, the apartment was empty. No furniture, no belongings, no Daniel. Just the walls, freshly painted as if nothing had ever been disturbed. 3 weeks later, a new tenant moved in. The first night, she heard nothing. The second night, she slept soundly. But on the third night, as she drifted towards sleep, the walls began to whisper. Get out. Run. Before you end up like me. She pressed her ear to the plaster. The voice was weak, struggling like something fading. Help me. I'm Daniel. I'm still here. But by morning, the whispers had ceased, and the walls, once again, looked brand new. Laura Mitchell disappeared on a Tuesday. Jacob Hensley stood in the empty apartment, keys jangling nervously in his hand. The space that yesterday had been filled with Laura's paintings, furniture, and personal belongings was now completely bare. A single trace remained of the quiet artist who had lived there for 6 months. No forwarding address, no notice was given, no explanation. It wasn't the first time this had happened at Everwood Apartments. As the building's landlord for 15 years, Jacob had grown accustomed to the unusually high turnover rate. Tenants arrived with hope and enthusiasm, only to vanish without warning months later. He had always brushed it off as a coincidence, a quirk of managing property on the outskirts of a bustling city where people were transient by nature. But 12 disappearances in 10 years was beyond coincidence. Jacob began with the building records, dusty ledgers tracking decades of occupancy. A pattern emerged: each vanished tenant had occupied one of 4 specific apartments, and their leases all contained a peculiar stamp: Everwood Realty. The security cameras outside were always mysteriously offline during the nights people disappeared. "I heard footsteps last night," Mrs. Grayson from 3B told him, her voice dropping to a whisper. But when I looked through the peephole, nobody was there. Other tenants reported similar disturbances: shadows moving in empty hallways, doors creaking open on their own, and a low, persistent humming that seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves. "There's something wrong with this building," Mr. Chen from 2A insisted. "It watches us."
Hi.
Jacob sat in the darkness of his apartment, eyes fixed on the hallway monitor he'd installed. For weeks, he'd maintained this vigil, searching for any clue to explain the disappearances. The footsteps started as they always did, faint at first, then growing louder as they approached. But the hallway remained empty. The building's electricity flickered once, twice, then plunged into darkness. "Not tonight," Jacob muttered, grabbing his flashlight and heading for the basement. For the basement air hung heavy with mold and secrets. Jacob's flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he made his way toward the electrical panel. That's when he noticed an old door, weathered and out of place, partially hidden behind stacked crates and forgotten furniture. It shouldn't be there. He knew every inch of this building. His hand trembled as he pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Jacob hesitated only briefly before his need for answers outweighed his growing fear. The stairs led to a room that defied architectural logic. It existed in a space where no room should be. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and shelves stacked with yellow documents, all bearing the name Everwood Realty. In the center stood a massive oak desk with a leather-bound ledger. Jacob opened it with trembling hands. Each page contained a tenant's name, the date they moved in, and a third column simply labeled collection date. Laura Mitchell's name was the last entry. Her collection date was yesterday. Behind the ledger lay a document that made Jacob's blood turn to ice. Those who sign the lease are bound beyond time, claimed by the original owners until their cycle is complete. A faded photograph of Victor Ashford, the building's original owner, was attached. A gaunt man with hollow eyes and an unsettling smile. Historical records described him as a reclusive businessman with an obsession for extending life beyond natural limits. A whisper brushed against Jacob's ear, not in words, but in an aching sense of foreboding. He wasn't alone. Jacob fled the basement, locking the door behind him, though he doubted a physical barrier would matter. City archives revealed the truth. Everwood Realty was forcibly shut down in 1952 after multiple reports of missing tenants. According to newspaper clippings, Victor Ashford had conducted experiments within the walls of Everwood experiments concerning the transfer of energy, preservation of consciousness, and the binding of souls to physical locations. Authorities had never found evidence of foul play, but Ashford himself had vanished without a trace. The building had changed hands numerous times since then. But something of Ashford remained, something that still collected its due according to contracts signed in ignorance. Jacob packed his belongings that night. Couldn't prove what he knew, couldn't explain it in rational terms. But he understood now the building itself was Ashford's final experiment, a mechanism designed to feed on its occupants. He sold Everwood within the week, unburdening himself of its weight and its secrets. The new owners renovated extensively, modernizing the aging structure and renaming it the Ashford Residences in a cruel twist of unintended irony. Sleek marketing materials promised luxury living in a historic landmark with character. New tenants arrived eagerly, signing their leases with optimistic smiles. Jacob moved to another state, but occasionally checked online records. The pattern continued. People moved in, only to vanish months later with no digital footprint left behind. Sometimes, in his dreams, Jacob finds himself back in that hidden basement room. In those nightmares, the ledger always has a new final entry. his name with tomorrow's date in the collection column, and he wakes, wondering if he truly escaped or if his lease is simply on a longer term. The key to apartment 37 felt cold and Sarah-spalm as the landlord released it with visible reluctance. "You'll be fine," he muttered, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond her shoulder. Then came the pause, weighted with unspoken warnings. Sarah laughed, the sound echoing hollowly down the dim hallway. "Buildings creak, right?" The old man didn't smile. He simply turned and shuffled away, his footsteps fading into the building's persistent silence. 3 weeks earlier, Daniel Walsh had stood in this exact spot, receiving the same key, hearing the same warning. He too had dismissed it with casual confidence. A 32-year-old software engineer, seeking solitude after a painful divorce, Daniel had been drawn to the building's faded grandeur and affordable rent. The brick facade may have been weathered, the hallway lights perpetually flickering, but Daniel saw only opportunity, a chance to rebuild what he'd lost, a fresh start to erase the past. His first 2 nights in apartment 37 passed uneventfully. He unpacked his meager belongings, arranged his workspace by the window, and slept dreamlessly in the bedroom that still smelled faintly of the previous tenant's cologne. On the 3rd night, the whispers began. First, Daniel attributed the sounds to neighbors, to pipes, to the natural settling of an old building. Yet something about the whispers felt directed, intentional. They emerged from the walls during the quietest hours, when the city outside had fallen into rare stillness. Daniel, he bolted upright that 4th night, sweat-drenched sheets tangled around his legs. The whisper had been clear this time, unmistakably his name, spoken with intimate familiarity. "Hello?" he called into the darkness. "Is someone there?" The apartment answered with silence. Then, as if encouraged by his acknowledgement, the whispers multiplied. By morning, Daniel's eyes were bloodshot, his hands unsteady as he brewed coffee strong enough to burn away the night's unease. He found himself studying the apartment with renewed suspicion, the shadows that pooled too deeply in corners, the way the air felt thicker near certain walls. That evening, he knocked experimentally against the living room wall. The sound didn't echo back. Instead, it seemed absorbed, swallowed whole by something on the other side. "What happened to the previous tenant?" Daniel asked the landlord on day 5, cornering the old man in the lobby. The landlord's weathered face tightened. "Left suddenly, just like the one before." "And before that?" The old man's eyes darted away. "You should leave, Mr. Walsh. Break your lease. I won't hold you to it." Daniel's stomach clenched. "Why? What's in there? What's in my apartment?" The landlord simply shook his head and walked away. By the 7th night, the whispers had transformed into something more substantial. They carried weight, texture, a presence that disturbed the air. Daniel had pushed his furniture against the walls, had stuffed towels beneath his bedroom door, and had left every light blazing. None of it mattered. The shadows moved independently of light sources now. They stretched across his ceiling in impossible patterns, extended tendrils down the walls toward his bed. The cold spots had multiplied patches of air so frigid they burned his skin when he walked through them. That night, as he huddled against his headboard, phone clutched in trembling fingers, Daniel heard something new. A scrape, slow and deliberate like fingernails against wood. It came from outside his bedroom door once, twice, then a pause. Then the handle began to turn. Daniel lunged forward, grasping the handle from his side, holding it in place as his muscles strained against whatever force pushed from the hallway. His breath came in ragged gasps, prayers forming and dissolving on his lips. The pressure increased. Metal groaned beneath his grip. "Daniel, let us in." The whisper slithered through the gap beneath the door, bringing with it a darkness that moved with purposa, liquid shadow that pooled on his bedroom floor before stretching upward, forming elongated fingers that reached for his bare ankles. Daniel screamed, releasing the door handle to scramble backward. His shoulder blades hit the window glass cold. Too cold, and he turned to find more shadows pressing against the outside. Their forms vaguely human but distorted, elongated limbs and misshapen heads visible against the night sky. The bedroom door swung open. Daniel saw only darkness, a void that breathed and moved with terrible purpose. It surged forward, and Daniel Walsh existed no more. 3 days later, the landlord discovered apartment 37 empty. No signs of struggle, no abandoned belongings, just pristine silence and the faint scent of cologne hanging in the still air. He sighed heavily, running his fingers along the doorframe where generations of previous tenants had unknowingly traced the same pattern. They always do, he muttered to himself. Now, Sarah stood in the center of apartment 37, admiring the spacious living room and the large windows that welcomed the afternoon sunlight. She didn't notice how the shadows lingered too long in certain corners, how the air felt resistant when she moved through particular spaces. That night, as she drifted towards sleep in her new bedroom, a whisper curled through the darkness. "Help me, ... Her eyes flew open. The voice wasn't hers. It was Daniel's, and he wasn't alone.